My life for a number of years has been preoccupied in one way or another with this question. What would happen to the way we view the world, ourselves, God, our Christian gospel, if we put back in the Bible, in our functional Bibles, 4 chapters that are often missing from our Bibles, the first 2 and the last 2? As many Christians have operated in culture with a functional Bible that begins in Genesis 3 with sin and ends in Revelation 20 with the lake of fire. So it's a bad news to bad news story. But what if we had a good news to good news story? A story that begins in the good, very good world of Genesis 1, and that's aiming and stretching and tending towards the glory of a remade world. So I asked that question about culture, but now more and more I find myself asking that question about power. Is there a good news to good news story about power that also does justice to the full catastrophe of Genesis 3 to Revelation 20? And that's what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes today. What happens when you take your bearings for power from Genesis 1? Well, we have to go somewhere that I know you all want to go at 9 a.m. At Q, which is grammar. I just thought it would be good to begin with some grammar. When you think of power, I think the grammatical mood you most readily think of is the imperative. Do something. It's the kind of power you have when you have the power to command. For those of us who are Gen Xers of a certain age, the go-to example is Jean-Luc Picard, having just taken a drink of Earl Grey tea on the deck of the Starship Enterprise, lifts his finger and he says, "Make it so." My fellow 44-year-olds know what I'm talking about. It's the imperative mood. And what's very striking when you look at Genesis 1 is how few verbs are in the imperative mood. Instead, you find a very unfamiliar mood of the verb. It's called the jussive mood. Jussive, the jussive. And the jussive is not make it so. The jussive is the form of the verb used for prayer, used for invitation, used for request, and it's usually translated as let there be. Let there be light. Not make it so, not do something, but simply jussive, let there be. Creative power is jussive power that works with what does not even yet exist and calls being into being. Let the waters teem with living creatures, the jussive, and let the birds, jussive, fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God, in the jussive, let there be, created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind with which the waters teem. The Creator God, when he creates in the jussive mood, creates teeming. And this is the first idea that I want to share with you. Power is for teeming, or to be a little less odd sounding, power is for flourishing. Power is given in Genesis 1 and given over and over in the good story of creation in order that the world would flourish, that more and more being would abound, as Gabe put it really well, that everything might be and become everything it could be and become. This is true, by the way, in Genesis 1, even when God uses what we would call coercive power. The power to restrain. When God pushes the seas apart in order that dry land will appear, the restraint, the pushing apart, the coercing of matter is to create room for more flourishing, so that even coercion, even force is used for flourishing in the creation of the world. And, by the way, this is also true of Q, because we have this very coercive thing at Q. It's this screen that's counting down and says 1319 right now. And should I try to exceed the boundaries set for me by the creator of Q, when that thing goes to 0, you will start to exert coercive force upon me. It's very coercive. Why? Because I need to be restrained as a speaker. And every speaker who's going to come up today and tomorrow will feel like they don't have enough time, but the answer of Q is if we don't restrain you, Q can't flourish. Even coercion, even restraint is for flourishing. So the test of power is flourishing. Who is flourishing because you have power? Who is flourishing because we're here at Q? God entrusts the flourishing of the world to image bearers. Having issued the jussive creation of the world, God then turns to his image bearers and incidentally uses the imperative mood, be fruitful and multiply. Team, multiply my image in the world so that everywhere my image bearers go, there will be flourishing. Very interesting creatures that he entrusts this to. He gives it to us, who are, of all the creatures God makes, in many ways the most vulnerable. The only creatures that require a garden to survive in the very good world. The only creatures of whom it can be said that they can be naked. No other creature wakes up in the morning like I did and you did this morning and at some point says, I'm naked. But we, vulnerable image bearers, are naked, and yet we have everything we need to till and keep and tend the world. And here's where the full catastrophe comes in, because to deal with our nakedness, to deal with our vulnerability, we misuse our creativity. If the deepest expression of power is not force, but creation, not imperative, but jussive, so the deepest corruption of power is not violence, it's misplaced creativity. And the biblical word for this is idolatry. Idols are the result of human creativity misapplied to human vulnerability. And just as only human beings can be naked, we're the only creatures that are that vulnerable, so we are also the only creatures that make images of God that are not actually true to God. And every idol that we invest with God-like power makes two promises to us that address our vulnerability. Number one, you shall not surely die. Every idol promises, you shall not surely die, which is to say, you shall not have to be contingent, vulnerable, and dependent on another for your life. And corresponding to that, you will be like God. Every idol promises to elevate you from your meek image bearing into what you imagine is the likeness of God. And it will be cheap and fast. Idols promise to do this quickly and cheaply. And the reality of idols, the reality of idolatry, is that they work at first. Idols actually do initially deliver a delicious experience of escaping from our contingency and dependence into an experience of godlike power and control, or what we imagine to be godlike power and control. The problem is that idols don't keep working. As the psychiatrist Jeffrey Satinover has put it, idols, which begin by promising everything, you shall not die, you shall be like God, and demanding almost nothing, cheap and fast, gradually cease to work until eventually they deliver nothing while extracting everything, demanding everything. And this leads to the third truth of power. So the first is power is for flourishing. The second is that we misuse our power to make idols. And the third truth is that those who make them become like them. Those who make idols become like idols. Those who make false gods begin to play false gods. We begin to imitate these things that make great promises up front at very little cost, but actually deliver nothing in the end at incredible cost, exploiting the world. And if the biblical name for misusing our power to make false gods is idolatry, the biblical name for misusing our power to play a false god is injustice. And that's why the Hebrew prophets never separate idolatry from injustice. They're always going back and forth between idolatry and injustice, because in the biblical mind, idolatry, the making of God, false gods, and injustice, the playing of a false god, go together. I learned this from a man named Jaikumar Christian, who's the head of World Vision in India. And as Jaikumar and I were going to visit a district where child slavery had been endemic for generations, he said, "Andy, I want you to understand what you're about to see." He said, "When you see poverty, you need to understand that poverty is simply the result of someone playing God in the life of someone else." And suddenly realized, oh my goodness, idolatry and injustice are not different things. They are the same thing. Playing not the true God, not the jussive, let it be, creative, flourishing seeking God, but playing an idol who extracts from the poor at first simply their livelihood and substance of their life, but ultimately eradicates the image of God in them. So that a world that's filled with injustice is a world where the image of God has been lost, both in the exaggerated power of the idol-making injustice doer and the eradicated image in the poor. The world meant to be full of true images is now full of false images. So God looks at this world meant for flourishing, now full of false images, and hates what he sees and mourns what he sees, and yet has a redemptive plan for what he sees. Which brings us to this man. No one exemplified image-bearing, jussive, let-it-be creativity in my lifetime like Steve Jobs, an image-bearer of God, without whose creations, may it be said, if all of them were removed from this room in one rapture-like moment, I think Q would simply cease to exist. Our being would collapse into a meek group of naked, vulnerable people, right? So we're very grateful to the image-bearing capacity of Steve Jobs and all those whose flourishing he contributed to. But what we've learned from Walter Isaacson's biography is that Steve Jobs, who was an image-bearer, also had an idol. And it wasn't technology. It was pretty literally an apple. Isaacson's biography unfolds what I don't think many people outside of Jobs' own private circle had understood or guessed, which is that Steve Jobs, from a very early stage in his life, had an idol, and it was food. He had an eating disorder, or a series of eating disorders, because when he was very young, he discovered that by embracing extreme diets, minimal diets, fruitarian diets, at one stage he went 2 weeks eating only apples. The Freudians among you can just work on that one for a little bit. That he embraced these extreme diets that initially gave him a sense of godlike control and exhilaration, as extreme diets do. But as his life went on, Steve Jobs became more and more dependent on what Isaacson baldly calls his eating disorder. In 2003, he was diagnosed with islet cell pancreatic cancer, which is incredibly good news for a cancer diagnosis, because islet cell pancreatic cancer is almost always isolatable and curable by the removal of the pancreas. For 9 months after his diagnosis, against the pleas of his family and friends, Steve Jobs refused surgery, refused seed control, refused to be vulnerable, and instead attempted to treat his cancer with more and more outlandish diets. And by the time he has accepted surgery, 9 months later, the cancer had spread to his liver, and it was only a matter of time. The idol that Steve Jobs served ultimately robbed him of life, robbed us of a culture maker, robbed his children of a father. Idols destroy wherever they go, and yet we entrust ourselves to them because they tell us, you shall not surely die. You shall be like God. I wish it was just Steve Jobs who did that. But this is all of our temptation, and nowhere more than when we come to Washington. Last week, a very powerful person in Washington invited me to breakfast. And it's not who you're thinking. A bunch of us were here for the Easter prayer breakfast with the president, and we were honored to be here. But the night before, a bunch of us were hanging out at the W Hotel just around the corner. And it was late into the night, and I was having an amazing conversation with a very powerful person. Someone whose work I tremendously admire, and who's celebrated and known all over the world. I just couldn't believe I was talking with this person. And late into the early hours of the morning, as we were all sort of woozily, though not intoxicatedly, making our way towards bed, he said, "Hey, do you want to have breakfast?" Well, I already had plans with the president, but you don't say no when one of your idols asks you if you want to have breakfast. I said, "Sure, what time?" He said, "How about 7 a.m.? It was at this point about 1:30. Doing the math, I realized I'd get about 5.5 hours of sleep, and of course, I said yes. And we had a wonderful breakfast. And then I went home in a fog of fatigue, and for 2 days was unavailable in all the most important ways to my wife, my children, the work I really had to do. That little taste of power. You shall not surely have to sleep. You aren't really a creature. And I don't know if that breakfast in and of itself was idolatrous, but I know that it partook of a pattern in my life that, if left unchecked by worship, would destroy me, my marriage, and anything I have to give to the world. Do we believe that we're enough in our image bearing? In our vulnerability and dependence and nakedness? Do we believe that we can be agents of flourishing without having to make or become idols? That is the question of power. And the biblical answer is yes. The Jussiv is not just the mood of creation. It's the mood of prayer. Let it be. And the biblical story hinges on an image bearer who said, "Let it be to me according to your word." The Jussiv, one of God's own creatures brought into being by God's Jussiv power, said back to God, "Let it be." Q for you will either be about idols, idol making, idol playing, or it will be a way of saying back to the one who said, "Let there be," for us to say to God, "Yes, let it be in us according to your word."